They had just crossed a canal that should have taken days to force, and instead it had taken hours. Heinz Guderian stood on a low rise above the water and looked toward Dunkirk. From where he stood, he could see the town's outline. His tanks had thrown pontoon bridges across the Ie Canal. A handful of armored vehicles had already crossed to the far bank. The port that held the entire British field army was now less than 15 miles away, undefended by anything that could stop a panzer division. Then an order arrived from headquarters. Stop where you are. Do not advance. Guderian did not understand it. Neither did most of the men around him. They had spent 2 weeks proving that speed could break an army that outnumbered them. Now, at the exact moment speed mattered most, they were being told to wait. This is the strange center of one of the most famous puzzles of the Second World War. Germany did not fail to trap the British army at Dunkirk. It succeeded completely. The British Expeditionary Force was surrounded, exhausted, short on ammunition, and pinned against a coastline with nowhere left to retreat. And then, with the kill available, the German army stopped moving for 2 full days at the exact hour it needed to keep moving. The obvious question is, why? But that question has an unsatisfying answer if you stop at the surface. Yes, Hitler issued a halt order. Yes, it gave the British time to organize an evacuation. But a simple signature does not explain a catastrophe of this size. It only opens the door to a much bigger story, one involving overconfident tank commanders, nervous generals, a Luftwaffe chief eager for personal glory, a landscape that looked deceptively easy to cross, and a British admiral who had begun planning an escape a full week before anyone in Germany thought escape was even possible. To understand why Germany failed to destroy the British army at Dunkirk, you have to understand why German commanders believed, quite reasonably, that they had already won. Let's go back to the beginning of the campaign, because the ending only makes sense once you understand what everyone expected to happen instead. On May the 10th, 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. British and French planners had anticipated this. What they had not anticipated was where the true weight of the attack would fall. The Allied High Command believed Germany would repeat a version of its 1914 strategy, sweeping through central Belgium with its main strength. In response, the best British and French divisions rushed north and east into Belgium to meet them, exactly as German planners hoped they would. Because the real German attack was coming through a place nobody expected serious armor to use at all. The Ardennes Forest, a region of steep hills and narrow roads in southern Belgium and Luxembourg, had been dismissed by French planning as unsuitable for a major armored thrust. Tanks, many assumed, simply could not move through that terrain in large numbers, at least not quickly enough to matter. German commanders disagreed, and this disagreement is where the entire Dunkirk story actually begins. A plan associated primarily with General Erich von Manstein proposed sending the main weight of German armor directly through the Ardennes, then across the Meuse River near Sedan, and then racing west toward the English Channel. If it worked, this would not just push the Allied armies backward. It would cut them in half. Everything about this plan depended on speed. Not ordinary military speed, but something closer to a controlled sprint. Day after day, deeper into enemy territory than doctrine typically allowed. The panzer divisions crossed the Meuse, broke through weak French defenses, and began racing toward the coast far faster than French commanders believed possible. Within roughly a week, spearheads reached the English Channel near Abbeville. Take a moment to understand what that meant. Every Allied unit that had rushed north into Belgium was now trapped between 2 German army groups, one pressing from the east, another curving around from the south and west, cutting off any route of retreat toward the rest of France. The plan had produced almost exactly the result its designers hoped for. British, French, and Belgian forces were now squeezed into a shrinking pocket in northern France and western Belgium, with the sea behind them and German forces on almost every landward side. If you were a German staff officer in the 3rd week of May, this looked less like an ongoing battle and more like a completed one. The only remaining question seemed to be how fast the trapped armies could be finished off, not whether they could escape. That expectation was not arrogance. It was based on genuine, observable success. The panzers had covered distances in days that pre-war planners assumed would take weeks. French counterattacks, including a notable armored thrust near Arras, led partly by a young British general named Rommel, would later face on other battlefields, had been contained, though not without giving German commanders a jolt of anxiety about their exposed flanks. And this is where the story stops being simple. Because the very thing that had made the German plan brilliant, the relentless, headlong advance of the panzer divisions, was quietly creating a problem that nobody had fully solved. Tanks had raced across northern France so quickly that the infantry, artillery, and supply columns supporting them were now strung out for miles behind, struggling to keep pace. Fuel convoys were falling behind schedule. Repair depots could not always reach broken-down vehicles in time. Some panzer units had been fighting and moving almost continuously for nearly 2 weeks, and mechanical wear was starting to show. None of this was fatal on its own, but it meant that by the time the panzer spearheads reached the outskirts of Dunkirk, several senior commanders were quietly worried about pushing their armored forces even further before repairing and consolidating them. That worry would matter enormously in the days ahead, but it wasn't the only problem developing. While German tank crews worried about their engines, another set of commanders was worrying about something else entirely: the ground itself. Northern France and Flanders, especially the country immediately around Dunkirk, is crossed by canals, drainage ditches, and low-lying farmland that floods easily. It is very different terrain from the open plains further south where the panzers had performed so well. Some German commanders, including the officer directing the overall advance, Colonel General Guderian and Rundstedt, began to question whether this particular landscape was even suitable for a full armored assault. Marshy ground, canal lines, and narrow causeways are not ideal territory for fast-moving tank columns. Hitler had his own memories of this exact region. He had served on the Western Front in the First World War, in areas not far from Flanders, and he was reportedly familiar with how difficult that terrain could become for large formations, especially in wet conditions. So when Rundstedt suggested that the armor should pause, consolidate, and let the infantry and Luftwaffe handle the final destruction of the pocket, it wasn't an obviously foolish suggestion. It reflected genuine operational concern shared by experienced commanders who had just watched their equipment strain itself to the breaking point over 2 extraordinary weeks. On May the 23rd, senior commanders in the field, including General Günther von Kluge, proposed that advancing forces should pause and consolidate their positions rather than pressing forward immediately. On 23 May, Günther von Kluge proposed that the German Fourth Army, which was poised to continue the attack against the Allied forces at Dunkirk, should halt and close up. Rundstedt agreed with the recommendation, seeing the Allies trapped in the pocket and assuming there was no urgency. Not everyone agreed. General Walther von Brauch, the commander-in-chief of the German army, disagreed with his colleagues and wanted to continue the attack without delay. He understood correctly that every day given to a trapped enemy is a day they can use to organize a defense, or worse, an escape. This is one of the more overlooked details of the whole Dunkirk story. The halt was not simply handed down from Hitler out of nowhere. It began as a field recommendation from experienced commanders who had genuine defensible reasons for caution. But reasonable caution, applied at the wrong moment, can produce consequences nobody intended. On the morning of May the 24th, Hitler traveled to Rundstedt's headquarters at Charleville to review the situation personally. Hitler was in fine spirits that morning. His panzer divisions within 15 miles of what was left of the defeated British army trapped near Dunkirk, and he believed decisive victory was at hand. What he found waiting for him was not a commander eager to finish the job immediately. He was astonished to learn that Rundstedt wasn't planning to continue the attack. Rundstedt assumed the British had nowhere to go and that Luftwaffe bombardment would soon compel their surrender. And he wanted his tanks in good repair for the deployment south against the remaining French forces. Here is where a second figure enters the story, and his role deserves attention because it changes the entire calculation. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and at this point one of the most powerful men in Germany, was eager to claim personal credit for finishing off the trapped Allied armies. Göring agreed with the recommendation to hold the tanks back, and his mind made up. Hitler momentarily wavered on whether to overrule Rundstedt. The Luftwaffe, Göring argued, could annihilate the pocket from the air, sparing the precious panzer divisions for the harder fighting still to come against the main French army further south. Notice what this offer actually appealed to. It wasn't sentiment, it was economy of force. The idea that Germany's most valuable mechanized units shouldn't be risked finishing a job that air power alone could apparently complete just as well. Given everything Rundstedt had already told him about worn tanks and difficult terrain, given his own memories of how badly armor could get bogged down in that landscape, and given Göring's confident promise that his aircraft could seal the pocket from above, Hitler approved the halt order. Armored units were to stop along a line running roughly from Lens, der Bethune, Aire, and St. Omer to Gravelines, just short of Dunkirk itself. Many of Hitler's generals, including Rundstedt and Manstein, would later argue against the order, urging Hitler to allow the German army to continue its advance, but Hitler remained adamant, and the order stayed in place. For 2 days, some of the most effective tank formations in the world sat still, staring at a town they could almost certainly have taken. It's worth pausing on how strange this looked from inside the German army at the time. One officer later recalled that there was no way to refute the order because nobody knew the reasoning behind it, and panzer crews were simply told to hold the canal line and use the pause for repairs. Guderian, watching from his forward position, considered the decision catastrophic. He would later identify it as the decision with the most disastrous influence on the whole future course of the war. That is a strong claim from a man who spent the rest of his career defending his own reputation as a tank commander, so it's worth treating with some skepticism. But even allowing for Guderian's bias, the practical effect of the halt is not really in dispute. For roughly 2 days, Guderian's tank crews watched in frustration as some 340,000 British and French soldiers prepared to evacuate from Dunkirk right in front of them. Notice something important here, though. The halt order alone did not create the entire disaster. It created an opening. What the British did with that opening is a completely separate part of the story, and arguably the more remarkable one. Because while German commanders were debating terrain and tank maintenance, a British admiral had already been quietly preparing for exactly this scenario, days before anyone believed it would actually happen. Vice Admiral Ramsay had been placed in charge of coordinating naval operations from a network of tunnels beneath Dover Castle, tunnels that had been carved into the cliffside decades earlier. From the 19th of May, realizing that rescue by sea would likely be necessary, Ramsay and his staff had already begun making plans and arranging for ships to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force. Think about the timing here. That's 5 days before Hitler even visited Rundstedt's headquarters. The British were preparing an escape route, while German commanders still believed total victory was simply a matter of finishing the job. This wasn't optimism on Ramsay's part. It was realism. British commanders on the ground could see the same map the Germans could. They understood their position was close to hopeless, and they understood that hope was not a plan. The operation received its now famous codename from something almost comically mundane. Operation Dynamo took its name from a room in the Dover Castle tunnels that had once held a literal dynamo, a machine used to generate electricity. There's something quietly appropriate about that. One of the most dramatic rescue operations in military history was named after a piece of Victorian electrical equipment sitting forgotten in a tunnel. By May the 26th, the situation had shifted enough that Ramsay's staff received formal authorization to begin. On the 26th of May, they were ordered to put their plans into action. That date matters enormously because it falls right in the middle of the German halt order. The 2 days German tanks spent motionless were almost exactly the 2 days the British spent transforming a contingency plan into an active operation. But planning an evacuation and actually carrying one out are two very different problems, and the geography of Dunkirk made this one brutally difficult. The harbor itself had already been heavily damaged by bombing, and its deep-water piers were dangerous, exposed positions under constant threat. Dunkirk's beaches were too shallow for Royal Navy battleships and larger vessels to safely approach at all. This created an immediate and serious complication. Britain had warships. It did not have nearly enough small, shallow draft vessels to ferry tens of thousands of men from open beaches out to those larger ships waiting further offshore. So the British Admiralty assembled roughly 700 civilian craft to carry troops out to the larger vessels waiting in deeper water. These were not warships. They were fishing boats, pleasure yachts, small motor launches, anything with a hull that could survive a channel crossing and a beach landing. The call went out to civilian boat owners along the coast, asking them to volunteer their vessels. And the response was overwhelming, with owners from all along the south and east coasts of England offering boats ranging from pleasure craft to working fishing boats. This is the origin of what later became known, somewhat romantically, as the Little Ships of Dunkirk. It's a phrase that sounds like folklore. It wasn't. It was an improvised solution to a genuine and immediate transport bottleneck, one that emerged because nobody had planned for an evacuation of this scale from a beach this shallow. There was also a more practical fix happening at the same time, one that received less attention than the little ships but arguably mattered just as much. Captain William Tennant, overseeing the beach operation directly, realized that loading men straight off open sand was slow and dangerous. Tennant observed that evacuating troops directly from the beach would be arduous and costly. So he directed soldiers instead to board rescue ships from a long stone and timber breakwater stretching out into deeper water. That breakwater, known as the Mole, had never been designed for this purpose. It became, almost by improvisation, the single most important piece of infrastructure in the entire evacuation. So while German tanks sat parked along a canal line, waiting for permission to move, the British were solving an entirely different set of problems. How to load exhausted men quickly, how to keep them organized under bombing, and how to squeeze an impossible number of soldiers through a very narrow physical bottleneck. Meanwhile, the ground war around the pocket had not stopped just because the panzers had. Infantry divisions, artillery, and above all, the Luftwaffe continued pressing the shrinking Allied perimeter, exactly as Göring had promised Hitler they could. This is where the plan's second major flaw revealed itself, and it had nothing to do with tanks at all. Göring's promise rested on an assumption that air power alone, without armor to follow up and physically occupy ground, could destroy a cornered army and prevent an evacuation. That assumption would be tested directly over the beaches of Dunkirk, and it would not hold up nearly as well as he expected. Weather over the English Channel in late May 1940 was frequently poor, with low cloud and periods of rain that grounded or hampered German bombing runs on several critical days. An air force that depends on clear skies to find and hit ships and columns of men on a beach is an air force with a built-in weakness whenever the weather refuses to cooperate. There was a second problem, one the Germans had less control over entirely. Dunkirk sits close enough to the English coast that Royal Air Force fighters based in southern England could reach the pocket, engage German aircraft, and return to refuel, all without needing forward airfields in France. German fighters escorting the bombers, by contrast, were operating at the edge of their range, with less time available over the target area before needing to turn back. This created running air battles over the beaches throughout the evacuation. And while the Luftwaffe inflicted real damage, it never achieved the kind of total, uncontested destruction Göring had promised Hitler it would deliver. So here is the situation forming by the time the halt order was finally lifted on May the 26th. The panzers were released to advance again, but the 2 critical days of delay had already let the British establish naval coordination, begin ferrying troops, and organize a defensive perimeter around the shrinking pocket. And the alternative Göring had offered instead of using the tanks, systematic destruction from the air, was proving far less reliable than promised. Thanks to weather, distance, and the presence of an air force operating from its own home territory. This is the moment worth sitting with because it captures something important about how military disasters actually unfold. No single decision destroyed the German opportunity at Dunkirk. A series of individually reasonable choices interacted with each other in ways nobody at the time could have fully predicted. Rundstedt's caution about tank maintenance was reasonable. Hitler's memory of difficult terrain was reasonable. Göring's confidence in his air force, given the string of German victories over the preceding weeks, wasn't obviously absurd either. Put all 3 together, though, and you get exactly the kind of gap an admiral in a Dover tunnel had been quietly hoping for. While all this was happening at the strategic level, the human experience on the ground looked nothing like a tidy chain of cause and effect. It looked like exhaustion, confusion, and improvisation on both sides of the line. British and French rearguard units, often fighting with dwindling ammunition, were tasked with holding the shrinking perimeter open long enough for the evacuation to continue. Some of the fiercest fighting of the entire campaign happened not on the beaches themselves, but along the defensive ring protecting them, where soldiers understood, with total clarity, that their job was to buy time rather than to survive. Further south, at Calais, a separate and smaller garrison of British and French troops had been ordered to hold the port for as long as possible. A decision that essentially sacrificed that garrison to slow the German advance and buy additional hours for the main evacuation further north. The Germans took Boulogne on the 25th of May and Calais the following day, leaving Dunkirk as the only viable port from which the British Expeditionary Force, part of the French army, and the remnants of the Belgian army could escape. That detail matters more than it might first appear. By the time Calais fell, Dunkirk wasn't simply the best remaining option. It was the only option left on the entire coast. Belgium's position collapsed at almost exactly the same time, even before the German military forced Belgium's surrender on May the 28th. The British government had already been quietly preparing for an evacuation of its ground forces and other Allied troops under the code name Operation Dynamo. Notice the sequencing again. Belgium's surrender didn't trigger British planning. It confirmed what British planners already suspected was coming and had already begun preparing for. For ordinary soldiers inside the pocket, none of this larger picture would have been obvious. What they experienced was long queues on open beaches, aircraft passing overhead, sporadic shelling, and long stretches of waiting punctuated by moments of real terror. Some men waded out into the surf for hours, waiting their turn to be picked up by small boats ferrying them to larger ships anchored further out. Others queued along the stone mole, moving forward step by step as ships loaded and departed. There was nothing glamorous about most of it. It was cold, it was slow, and it was frightening, made bearable mainly by discipline, by the presence of officers keeping order, and by the simple fact that boats kept arriving. On the German side, the mood among forward units after the halt order was lifted was reportedly closer to frustration than triumph. They resumed the advance only to discover that the British perimeter had solidified in their absence, backed by artillery, prepared positions, and increasingly desperate but effective resistance. This is one of the clearer ironies of the whole episode. The halt order was partly justified by a desire to preserve German armor for future operations further south. But every hour spent preserving that armor gave the defenders time to prepare exactly the kind of layered defensive positions that make armored assaults slower and more costly. In other words, the pause designed to protect the tanks ended up making the tanks' eventual job harder, not easier. Meanwhile, out at sea, the evacuation was accelerating into something close to a continuous conveyor belt operation. Ships arrived, loaded as many men as physically possible, and departed, often under fire, to be replaced almost immediately by the next vessel in line. The Royal Navy contributed destroyers and larger transport ships wherever the shallow water allowed them near enough to be useful. The Royal Navy dispatched over 220 naval vessels, including destroyers and transport ships, though the shallow waters near the beaches made these larger ships impractical for direct evacuation in many places. This is precisely why the smaller civilian vessels mattered so much. This limitation led to the significant involvement of smaller civilian craft, which could navigate closer to shore. With over 800 civilian boats participating and many piloted by their own owners, who bravely entered the war zone. It's worth pausing here on just how unusual this arrangement was. Very few military evacuations in history have depended so heavily on private citizens sailing their own boats directly into an active combat zone, often with no naval training and no weapons to defend themselves. Some of those boats never made it back. Losses among both naval and civilian vessels were significant, and German aircraft continued to target ships throughout the evacuation whenever weather allowed clear bombing runs. Still, the numbers being moved off the beaches each day continued to climb, and this created a new kind of pressure on the German side. Every additional day the perimeter held meant tens of thousands more soldiers reaching England, soldiers who represented the trained, professional core of Britain's ground forces. That last point deserves emphasis because it explains why Dunkirk mattered so much more than the simple headcount of survivors might suggest. The men being evacuated weren't just bodies. They were the officers, non-commissioned officers, and experienced units that Britain would need to rebuild an army capable of eventually fighting again in continental Europe. Losing them entirely as a captured or destroyed force would have set British rearmament back by years, at a moment when Britain had no other trained field army in reserve. Getting them home, even without their tanks, trucks, and heavy equipment, meant Britain retained the human foundation on which a future army could be built. This is the strategic reason the evacuation mattered so much more than its tactical details might suggest on their own. Germany had won an overwhelming operational victory in the Battle of France. But if the trapped British army escaped largely intact as fighting personnel, that victory would be incomplete in a very specific and consequential way. By the final days of the operation in early June, the perimeter had shrunk to almost nothing, and the evacuation was becoming increasingly dangerous and increasingly urgent. French units, understanding that they were now covering the final stages of the withdrawal, continued fighting rearguard actions even as the last British formations boarded ships. This detail is important, and it's sometimes underplayed in popular retellings that focus mainly on British ships and British soldiers. French forces played a critical role in holding the perimeter open during the final phase of the evacuation, at real cost to themselves. And thousands of French troops were evacuated alongside the British in the operation's last days. The evacuation formally ran from late May into the first days of June. The evacuation lasted from the 26th of May to the 4th of June 1940. And under intensive firing and bombing, 338,000 troops were brought back over the English Channel. The precise figure often cited by historians is even more specific. After appealing to boatyards, yacht clubs, and yachtsmen throughout the southeast of England, the Admiralty managed to gather around 700 small craft which, along with roughly 200 military vessels, rescued an astonishing 338,226 troops over 9 days. Sit with that number for a moment, because at the very start of the operation, nobody expected anything close to it. British planners initially hoped they might save perhaps 30 or 40,000 men before the perimeter collapsed entirely. What actually happened exceeded even the most optimistic internal estimates by a staggering margin. That gap between expectation and outcome is really the heart of this entire story. Germany expected total destruction of a trapped enemy army. Britain, at best, hoped to save a fraction of that army. Neither side's expectation matched what actually happened, and the reasons why deserve careful unpacking rather than a simple, tidy explanation. It would be convenient, and it's a popular version of this story, to say Germany simply made one enormous mistake, the halt order, and that mistake alone explains everything. But that version doesn't survive close examination, and serious historians have spent decades pushing back against it. There's a particular myth surrounding this story that deserves to be addressed directly because it circulates constantly in popular retellings and it simply isn't supported by the evidence. The idea that Hitler halted his tanks out of some kind of ideological sympathy for the British, hoping to preserve their army as a gesture toward a future peace settlement. Historians have worked to put to rest the myth that Hitler issued his May 24th halt order out of sympathy for the British and in hopes of a peace agreement. The actual documentary record simply doesn't support that narrative in any serious way. What the record does support is something less dramatic but ultimately more interesting. On May the 23rd, Hitler received reports from Rundstedt and General Paul von Kleist expressing the need to rest and refit their panzer divisions. While French divisions had established strong defensive positions that had so far repelled German thrusts into the pocket, and rumors also spread among German ground commanders of a possible impending Allied counterattack. Despite the popular misconception, Hitler's halt order had nothing to do with racial sympathy or hope of a peace agreement, and Hitler and many of his generals simply failed to recognize the reality of the battlefield situation, which led to a disastrous decision that allowed the Allies to escape. That's a genuinely important distinction because it changes what kind of failure this actually was. It wasn't a moral failure or a secret political calculation. It was an intelligence and judgment failure, one built from worn-out equipment reports, exaggerated fears of French counterattacks, and overconfidence in what air power alone could accomplish. And this is where the multi-causal nature of the disaster becomes unavoidable. The halt order didn't happen in isolation. It happened because tank maintenance genuinely was a real problem after 2 weeks of continuous advance. It happened because Rundstedt and Kleist genuinely believed French resistance in the pocket was stronger than it actually was. It happened because Göring genuinely believed his Luftwaffe could finish the job from the air. And it happened because Hitler genuinely remembered how difficult the terrain around Flanders could become for armor. Remove any single one of those factors, and the halt order might never have been issued, or might have lasted only a few hours instead of 2 full days. But all 4 factors arrived together at the same headquarters on the same morning and reinforced each other into a decision that, in hindsight, looks almost impossible to justify. That's the trap of hindsight, though, and it's worth resisting. From where Rundstedt and Hitler stood on the morning of May the 24th, pausing to consolidate a spectacular, unprecedented advance, while handing the final blow to an air force that had performed brilliantly for 2 straight weeks, did not look reckless. It looked like sound, conservative generalship after an extraordinary and risky gamble had already paid off beyond anyone's expectations. The problem wasn't that the decision was stupid. The problem was that it was made without full knowledge of 2 things happening simultaneously on the other side of the hill. An admiral in a Dover tunnel who had already begun preparing an evacuation days earlier than German intelligence assumed was possible, and a British defensive perimeter that would prove far more resilient and far better organized than anyone in Army Group A's headquarters expected. There is a further irony buried in here, one that connects directly back to Göring's confident promise. The Luftwaffe had performed brilliantly during the Battle of France, precisely because it operated in support of fast-moving ground forces, striking targets identified and exploited immediately by advancing panzers, asked to perform a completely different mission instead, independently destroying a static, defended pocket without ground forces to follow up and occupy territory. It was operating outside the conditions that had made it so effective in the first place. Air power alone, without infantry or armor to hold ground and disrupt the enemy at close range, struggled against a determined defense. Adverse weather, and an opposing air force fighting from its own home bases. Göring had essentially asked his air force to solve a problem it wasn't structurally designed to solve on its own. And the gap between his promise and the Luftwaffe's actual performance became the space in which the evacuation succeeded. By the time the panzers resumed their advance on May the 26th, this gap had already done its damage. The British perimeter was stronger, the evacuation infrastructure was operational, and precious days had already been converted into tens of thousands of soldiers safely back across the Channel. German forces did eventually push the perimeter back and force the final surrender of remaining rearguard positions around Dunkirk itself. But by then, the operation's central purpose, destroying the British field army as an intact fighting force, had already slipped out of reach. What Germany was left with instead was an overwhelming tactical and operational victory that fell short of a complete strategic one. The equipment losses inflicted on the retreating British army were genuinely severe. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and vast quantities of supplies were abandoned on the beaches and roads leading to them, because there simply wasn't room or time to load bulky equipment onto small evacuation boats. Britain's army came home essentially without its heavy weapons, and rebuilding that equipment would take considerable time and industrial effort in the months that followed. In that narrow sense, Germany's campaign had accomplished a great deal. But equipment can be replaced by an industrial economy still functioning at full capacity, protected by open ocean from immediate invasion. Trained soldiers, officers, and the organizational core of an army cannot be replaced nearly as quickly, and it was precisely that human core that escaped largely intact. This distinction mattered enormously for what came next. Just weeks later, France itself would fall, and Britain would find itself facing Germany essentially alone, without a continental ally still fighting on the ground. Had the British Expeditionary Force been captured or destroyed at Dunkirk rather than evacuated, Britain would have entered that isolated period without the trained soldiers needed to defend against invasion, or to eventually rebuild an offensive capability. The men who came home from those beaches became the foundation on which Britain's later war effort, from home defense through to the eventual return to the European continent years later, was built. None of this was obvious in June of 1940. At the time, the evacuation was widely understood correctly as an emergency rescue rather than any kind of victory. Winston Churchill himself was careful to remind the country that evacuations, however successful, are not the same thing as winning wars. Churchill recognized that the greatest challenge still lay ahead, as German ambitions now turned toward Britain itself. That warning proved entirely correct. The Battle of Britain and the broader question of whether Germany could force Britain out of the war still lay ahead, and none of it was guaranteed by what had happened at Dunkirk. Still, something had changed in a way that mattered enormously for everything that followed. Germany had come extraordinarily close to eliminating Britain's only trained field army in the opening weeks of the war in the West, and had failed to do so. Not because of any single dramatic Allied victory, but because of an accumulation of small German misjudgments interacting with unexpected British improvisation. Historians continue to debate exactly how decisive the halt order really was, and this debate is worth taking seriously rather than resolving too neatly. Some argue that even without the halt order, the difficult terrain, worn-out panzer units, and determined rearguard actions might have slowed the German advance enough for a significant evacuation to occur anyway, just on a smaller scale. Others argue the halt order was uniquely decisive, that those 2 lost days were the single largest contributing factor, separating a total catastrophe for Britain from a costly but survivable retreat. The honest answer is probably somewhere between these positions, and the exact weighting is not something the historical record can settle with total precision. What can be said with more confidence is this: no single explanation, not the halt order alone, not the terrain alone, not the weather over the Channel, not the Royal Air Force's proximity to home bases, not the little ships, not French rearguard sacrifice, fully accounts for what happened on its own. Each factor created space for the others to matter more than they otherwise would have. Remove the halt order and the British perimeter might never have solidified enough to organize an orderly evacuation at all. Remove the shallow beaches and the improvised fleet of small boats, and even a solid defensive perimeter might not have translated into an actual evacuation of hundreds of thousands of men. Remove the bad weather and the Royal Air Force's local advantage, and the Luftwaffe might well have delivered on Göring's promise after all. This is why the Dunkirk story resists simple morals. It isn't really a story about one German mistake. It's a story about how narrow the margin can be between a strategic disaster and a strategic near miss, and how many small, individually reasonable decisions had to line up, on both sides, to produce the outcome that actually occurred. Return for a moment to Guderian standing above the Canal, watching Dunkirk in the distance, and waiting for permission he did not receive for 2 agonizing days. He believed, standing there, that he was watching the final act of a campaign already won. In one sense, he was right. Germany did go on to defeat France within weeks. The Battle of France ended in a comprehensive German victory, and the strategic situation in continental Europe was transformed almost overnight in Germany's favor. But in another sense, the thing Guderian actually wanted, the annihilation of the British field army as a fighting force, slipped away in those exact 2 days, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with tanks, and almost everything to do with mud, memory, ambition, weather, and an admiral who had started planning for disaster before anyone else believed disaster was even on the table. The failure to destroy the British army at Dunkirk wasn't caused by one decision. It was caused by a system of decisions, each defensible on its own terms, that combined into an outcome none of the individual decision-makers actually intended. Rundstedt wanted to preserve his tanks. Göring wanted to preserve his air force's reputation. Hitler wanted to avoid repeating old mistakes from a war he remembered firsthand. Every one of those goals made sense individually. Together, they produced the opening through which an entire army walked, or waited, or queued for hours in cold water, back across the English Channel and out of what should have been a complete and final defeat.